So hi everyone, my name is Paul van Herk. I'm an architect and researcher and alumni of Strelka Institute's New Normal program from 2018. Our case study city here at Cultures of Congestion is Melbourne, Australia. The city doesn't boast the world's worst congestion, nor is it the best. It does rate very highly in livability rankings, partly because of a high infrastructure score and also because it's a city that's big enough to be a business and cultural centre, but not big enough to experience the intractable problems of congestion and inequality that we see in megacities. This segment focuses on institutions, and Melbourne's a relatively good place to look at them, not least of all because of the fact that the city's institutions, governments and interest groups, far from perfect as they are relatively functional and well-funded. They enjoy a reasonable degree of public support and trust, and this means that we can look at the public sector not as one struggling for relevance and revenue, but one that has a mandate to drive cultural change with popular support. Melbourne also stands out in our case studies as a city which is quite conservative in its layout, in its history. It's very suburban, spacious, and strictly zoned. That said, its population has just hit 5 million just this year. It's actually the fastest growing city in our study thanks to immigration. This means that it's about to become, for lack of a better term, a big city. We can clearly see this coming, which raises the question of how institutions can use their leverage to make changes before crisis points hit. Crisis points or critical points being a key concept in congestion. And then after a crisis point, institutions have to start looking how to put out fires, so to speak, when they lose the upper hand to complex change and it gets away from them. And the expression to put out fires has a double meaning here, given that every summer we're seeing increasingly horrific bushfires due to climate change in Australia. Planning here has been culturally conservative for a long time, partly because we're out here on the fringe of the Western world, but also because of the adaptations that come with size and high global connectivity haven't required us to be more radical. Our knowledge of international precedents, which have always been very strong, allow us to see what's coming beyond 5 million though. And some very large infrastructure projects are currently being built in Melbourne, which show that this fact is not lost on government, but it is a recent start and the culture is still catching up. Something that I don't spend a lot of time doing in the article is defining what an institution is or what congestion is, and I instead focus on salient case studies based on the discussions with the experts who are about to present. We could spend all day defining congestion or defining institutions, but exemplifying the culture is much more powerful. I've focused pretty heavily on state and local government institutions because they're the most directly involved with transport and land use planning here. The Australian federal government is in charge of taxation and does fund the states, but it's less directly involved in a spatial sense. I mentioned many other institutions like universities, think tanks, industry and owners lobbies, trade unions and transport consortiums. All these have had a fairly significant part to play in advising and pushing for certain kinds of change in mobility and land use. But when it comes to the central question of how institutions invest in congestion, government actors very quickly become primary, also as a result of the Australian context, which has, let's say, a fairly big and stable public sector. The article is called Investing in Lost Time, which sounds a little counterintuitive given that congestion is normally framed as a problem and a loss. So you may be wondering, how can you invest in a loss? Well, I suggest that no institution wants to see a decline in urban activity, but rather wants to see more activation, more transaction, and more interaction, of which congestion is a sure sign of. At the same time, institutions understand that arranging mobility more smartly allows more activity and also more value to be produced from it, while understanding that a state of congestion is always going to be there in some respect if you're lucky. That is to say, there's no negative value of congestion from the point of view of an institution. There's also another important central theme in the article when it comes to how institutions see congestion. Congestion is an amazing policy lever to achieve public, private sector and other institutional support for changes to the city and the culture that might otherwise not be popular, backed by the market or legal precedents as it stands. These things might include increasing density and mix, reducing road provision for cars, and reintroducing native and drought-tolerant vegetation into the city. These things actually meet with surprising amounts of resistance here, with a strong attachment to suburbia, which is no longer tenable, and for many people, it's not pleasant either. Overall, in the article, I've aimed to illustrate a story of Melbourne's places and characters beyond abstract traffic numbers, because it is a cultural shift that at this point in time will determine how the city shapes up in the near future. When looking at public institutions, I make sure to remind the reader that their investments are not the same as commercial investments. Their actions are not just a question of recouping value, but of making values. These ideas all emerge from highly informative and fascinating talks with two of Melbourne's most experienced strategic urban thinkers,